So, okay, let's talk about the thing that I wanted to talk about, which is Linus Sebastian. If you're not familiar, who are you? But Linus Sebastian is the guy behind Linus Tech Tips, and him and Luc Lafreniere have been like following the Steam Deck, and they've been talking about and very excited about the Steam Deck actually. So Luc and Linus decided that they were going to switch over to Linux on their primary daily driver, right? On their primary rig as their daily operating system. So the idea was that they weren't going to like ask for help from, any of the Linux experts on their team. They were just going to do it themselves to see what the authentic experience of switching from Windows to Linux was like as a normal person, right? Well, it turns out that Linus chose, it looks like Manjaro with KDE, which is like the default for Manjaro, right? Like if you go to their website, they do have multiple flavors, but KDE seems to be like their primary desktop environment. I have an issue with that. And I don't want to be one of these freaking like neckbeard armchair, pundits who's just saying, oh, he made the wrong choice. If he had done this and that, he would have had. This is just from my personal experience and having helped other people, like a lot of my friends who are like Windows power users come over to the Linux side of things, right? And I've found that like a lot of the Windows power users who are experienced with the Windows way of doing things look at the options, look at the screenshots and read some articles and say, KDE looks like it will be a lot like Windows, and that's why I'm going to go with it, right? But what I have found is that is very frequently the wrong decision for most of the people that I know. I feel like KDE is the best desktop environment for people who are already familiar with the Linux way of doing things and who are not afraid to get their hands dirty in the terminal, or who have experience enough to know how to Google to find the results, to say, I'm having this issue. They know how to articulate what the issue is so that they can find the answer on the internet. And because of that, a lot of the newbies that I have helped bring over to Linux, if they start with KDE, they end up having a very bad time. I've seen I have a friend who just switched over to Linux, and he switched over using KDE, and be it the AMD drivers or just the weirdness of KDE and the strange decisions that they make when it comes to widgets and Qt and all these things, just end up, he has all of these issues that I have literally never experienced being a tried and true dyed-in-the-wool GNOME guy, right? And it's kind of bananas to me, how very different our experiences have been as a new Linux user. I mean, I joined Linux. I started using Linux as my daily driver in I want to say Ubuntu 7, right? I think it was Ubuntu 7 or 8, and that's that was around the time, that was in the GNOME 2 era, and at that time, when GNOME started to transition to 3, I was, and Ubuntu moved over to Unity, I was kind of a nomad. I didn't know where I belonged, and I tried all kinds of different distros. And KDE, when I tried it, I was still kind of a noob at the time, and KDE provided very little in the way of feedback in terms of this is something weird happened and something's wrong and figure it out. I don't know. I don't even know where I'm going with this, but essentially I have found that KDE is the wrong choice for people who are not familiar with how Linux works. And so the idea of Linus coming in and trying that as his primary, as his first go it kind of boggles my mind.
What's the default on the Steam Deck? Is it KDE?
The default on the Steam Deck is KDE.
What is it specifically? Like, is it? Sorry, guys, I have not used KDE in a long time.
Yeah.
Is it? What's this plasma stuff? Is there plasma on the Steam Decks?
Yeah. So plasma. Whenever I have said KDE, I'm talking about KDE Plasma. That's basically KDE is like, the name of the project, and then Plasma is like the name of the desktop environment. So
I understand.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So the thought of and I'm not actually up in arms about Valve's decision here, actually, because truthfully, I don't think most people are going to be leaving big picture mode, or whatever they call it, like the Steam Deck UI.
I agree.
And those who do are probably only ever going to open up a web browser, right? Like I don't think a lot of, maybe install Lutris, right? And I think that Valve will probably have a way to do something like that doesn't involve like opening up the package manager and doing all of that extra crap, right? Like I think that it's going to be pretty straightforward, and the people who are going to be leaving big picture mode and trying to do other things like emulators are people who are either going to be following a guide or they're already going to know how to do it, right? So I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but the idea of like someone daily driving KDE, like KDE Plasma, sorry, as their first experience with daily driving Linux, I think that is a mistake. And it's one that I don't think most people would necessarily recognize because they don't have the experience to recognize it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Listen, my recommendation would be if someone asked me today, I want to get into Linux, what do I do?
Yeah.
What do I install? It wouldn't even take a second for me to make a recommendation.
Yeah.
And I would say install Elementary.
It's interesting. Okay.
Gonna be easy.
Yep.
It has a bunch of handlers for the Windowsisms and the Mac OS isms that you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if you download a .deb, which some of the internet will give you, it has this thing called sideload, which just, it prompts you. It tells you why you might not want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Just install random deb off the internet. But then you push proceed anyway, and you're done. And then you can do that for any random .deb you want.
Mm.
They have a app center, or an app store that meets, I think, user expectations coming from other platforms. And it's pretty nice. And then finally, there's not a lot of complicated menus. They're very thoughtful about their settings and about kind of where to find things. And so much so that you can see that GNOME, the newest GNOME 40, lifted a bunch of stuff from Elementary. And that's fine. I think GNOME should do that.
Yeah.
Elementary's desktop is a downstream of GNOME. So,
yeah.
For that reason, whenever I did watch the little like podcasts they have where Linus talked about his experience, and I was disappointed that in looking for a desktop environment and a distro, that he chose the ones that I would not have chosen at all.
Yeah. I there's a couple. So if I were to have to recommend to someone a distro, I would probably see. I have a couple different thoughts. Pop! OS is great. I love Pop! OS. I think that it does a lot of the work for you, right? Like especially having the two variants of the Radeon versus the AMD versus the NVIDIA, right?
That's a good point. Good point.
That takes away so much of the ambiguity of the idea of like, oh yeah, we have to have you have to install it, and then you have to install your drivers, but it doesn't work like it does on Windows. Like, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I agree.
Elementary is good. And I like everything that you said. It actually, when, as you were saying it, it all made a lot of sense to me. The thing is, I would probably recommend Manjaro with GNOME. Manjaro has some issues, but it also comes pre-installed with Steam, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And that the Windows way of doing things is just so backwards to me. Like, having been a Linux user for 10 years, it's like you go to a website, you download an exe, and you install it. And so, coming from that way of doing things, the package manager doesn't make any sense. Where are all of my partitions? All of my partitions are now, mount points. What is that? Where's my C drive, right? These are the kind of things that I think, GNOME handles pretty well.
Yep.
Manjaro handles that. If you take away that weird ambiguity of where is, how do I install Steam? Oh, it's already installed. I don't have to worry about it. I like that.
My problem is that Manjaro's underpinnings are Arch, and I say this as someone who's using Arch at this very second. The computer I'm sitting at is Arch, and I set it all up exactly to my standards, exactly how I wanted it. But I feel like every time I go to troubleshoot an issue, troubleshooting on Arch is a different experience than troubleshooting on a Debian or Ubuntu, especially Ubuntu-based distribution.
Yeah.
Because the distributions that are based on Ubuntu or Ubuntu itself the documentation is generally a different level than what the Arch documentation is. And that's not a knock against the Arch documentation. The Arch documentation is amazing, but it also assumes a level of technical competence and a familiarity with Linux that I just don't think that most people coming from Windows have. And that second part especially so, because I think Linus probably does have a very good technical literacy when it comes to most of the concepts that would exist inside the Arch wiki. But when you read certain commands or you see certain tools in the Arch wiki, and you've been using Linux for, since I was 14, and I'm 32 now, there's just a lot of random things that I know that I don't think the person who hasn't spent the last 18 years or whatever using Linux knows. There's just all this random knowledge that I have where I read something and I realize what this is going to entail.
Yeah.
And I just I'm skeptical that that's the right place to start. Maybe that will improve a lot, because there's going to be a ton of documentation around using Arch with the Steam Deck. Yeah. See, that's aimed more at the users that we're talking about.
Well, here's the thing. You say that Debian's documentation is better for beginners, but I don't necessarily think that's true. As someone who cut his teeth on Ubuntu, the idea of finding answers to my questions and knowing which one was applicable to Ubuntu, that was a lot more difficult. But if someone needs help with running Manjaro, pretty much anything in the Arch wiki is going to be applicable, and all you need to do is follow the guide in the Arch wiki. Usually, I mean, the Arch wiki is the definitive place for pretty much anything that you need to troubleshoot, I feel. So I don't know, but what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you there. I'm super curious to actually, I need to make sure I've seen the whole podcast because I've been posting them on YouTube of Linus's experience. I think I only saw two clips out of that, and I need to see what else he said. Could you kind of like maybe break it down, like some of the experiences that he has had in maybe the Cliff's Notes version, and then maybe I can tell you if I still agree with what I said earlier.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that he was talking about, I don't remember everything, but like one of the things that he was talking about was like, he has an NVIDIA graphics card, and so he used the NVIDIA drivers, and the NVIDIA drivers on Linux are junk. They're really bad. They still are. And the idea, like he had KDE running, and things would just like randomly break. Like, you know, moving a window around would cause it to like kind of flash or behave in a weird and unexpected way. And it all boils down to KDE at that point, I think. Well, I'm trying to think, what were the other things that I don't remember the rest of the stuff, but like, a lot of it came down to hardware too, because he's running some pretty cutting edge hardware, and most of that hardware doesn't have support for Linux from the vendor, which means that it relies on the kernel and you know, a lot of stuff just doesn't get added to the kernel, like you know, a Stream Deck, right? Like whatever else he has. And there was also like some refresh rate issues, FreeSync or not FreeSync, but G-Sync issues that he was having. A couple other things. I mean, a lot of his experience that he had comes down to the fact that he's running exotic hardware, but a lot of the other things, like if it doesn't have to do with the exotic hardware, it has to do with the fact that he's running KDE, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's crazy how much just past experience changes how you even select your hardware. Like when I did hear that part of the podcast, and I was thinking, like, why does he have so much exotic hardware other than that he gets a lot of you know, this stuff for his show. And then I realized, I haven't been selecting stuff that's like unique or novel for a while, because I'm pretty sure it's not going to work correctly.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so my build, my PC that I have upstairs as my like gaming PC, it was built, you know, to run Linux. And so I chose things that I knew. I didn't even really have to look it up. I just, you know, you see certain things and you're like, that's not going to work that well. And no, I know this will work well. And so it's a powerful PC, but it does not have, like, as you put it, really exotic hardware. It's very just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah.
And,
right.
Yeah. That's a good point. And it's interesting too. I try to think about the like psychology behind. Sometimes it's hard to imagine having an experience like his for me, because I haven't had one like that for so long.
Right.
But when I think about all the decisions made going into, you know, setting up a new computer and trying out a distro, I realize that I'm accounting for these things. I just don't realize that I'm accounting for them anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. It's interesting, like the perspective that we have. Cause like, I remember when I had like this HP Envy laptop with Beats audio, right? And I bought that thing, like that was like the second machine that I had like been running as my daily Linux driver, 2009.
I'm pretty sure I had that same exact laptop.
Big old fat thing. This thing was like probably 3 inches deep, like when the lid was closed. So, So I bought this machine, and I had been running a ThinkPad before that, right? I think it was a Lenovo ThinkPad. Maybe it was IBM, I can't remember, but it was a ThinkPad nonetheless. And so most everything worked just fine on the ThinkPad, right? I get this HP, the Wi-Fi didn't work, the speakers didn't work, like Pulse Audio just did not detect any of the audio hardware. The built-in Radeon graphics chip, like the integrated one, didn't have, like, you had to go in and actually do the what was that even thing, the Xconfig stuff, like, and I had no idea how to do that. But I can tell you that I was dedicated to using Linux at this point, and so I learned. I learned how to get all of it working. The next machine I had after that was a System 76 laptop, because I was like, I remember what happened back then, and I am not going to go through that pain again, you know? And that's one of the nice things about a lot of the hardware now is, like, it's all kind of been normalized. And so you're not going to have, like, these Wi-Fi chips that don't work on Linux. They mostly just do. And the audio hardware, similarly, it's like it all mostly just works. When you start getting into, like, exotic sound cards, like sound cards that are only supported on Windows, and you add them after the fact, they're aftermarket or whatever you want to call it, then you start running into issues where it's, you're running a crapshoot basically if it's going to work on Linux or not. You can, like, do a little bit of research. You can Google and say, hey, is this card with this model number going to work on Linux? Most of the time you'll get a good answer, but then you'll have like a different card revision. Suddenly it doesn't work, like everybody else says, oh yeah, it works. But if you have Rev 3 of the SN970 or whatever the heck it's going to be, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. And it's like, why? And it's so frustrating. And that's why I'm, like, hopeful that with the Steam Deck proliferating, and with the rumored other Valve console that they're developing, that's going to bring Linux to the fore and allow companies like Elgato and AverMedia and all these companies that make Linux-only hardware, Windows-only hardware, maybe they'll bring their drivers to Linux. That would be awesome. That would be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, my thoughts on this.
Yeah.
I think once people get their hands on the Steam Deck, there's just going to be, at the very least, so much tinkering that a lot of random stuff comes over, just because there are now, at least hundreds of thousands of people who might be doing something interesting with their Steam Deck, such as plugging in peripherals of different types and things like that. But yeah, so what do we think? What is your prediction for how Linus's experience is going to turn out here? His counterpart, whose name I'm blanking on,
Luke,
was not having the same level of difficulty. And seemed pretty optimistic about stuff, but Linus, he sounded like he was pretty, he was a little deflated, I think, whenever, at least the parts I heard.
So I suspect that Linus will eventually switch back to Windows, and probably before the Steam Deck even launches, if I'm being quite honest. Like, and I don't blame him, because, like, if you spend thousands of dollars on your machine and then you put Linux on it and very little of that, your investment works now, like, I don't blame him for wanting to switch back, right? Like, the thing is, I think Luke will probably stick with it for a while after Linus, just to gloat. But I think that Linus, like, I think that if they go at it again, Linus will probably have Anthony help him. And If you're not familiar, Anthony's like the resident Linux expert at LTT.
I do know Anthony.
Yeah,
I do know Anthony.
I've met him.
his videos.
He's such a cool dude. Like, he's so chill, and it's like,
Where did you meet him?
I met him at System 76 in 2019 at the 3rd Superfan event.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So he's very smart. He knows a lot about Linux, and he'll be able to figure all of this stuff out for Linus. But at the same time, that's kind of like a privilege of being Linus, and that's why he didn't have Anthony help him originally. So yeah, I think that like maybe down the road Linus will, I think they might build like a Steam Deck PC, and that's probably where that will exist for them, is on a dedicated hardware for that purpose, running probably SteamOS. But and I think Luke, like I said, Luke will probably stick with it because he already had experience with Linux as a daily driver. So yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Man.
We would love to know what everybody out there thinks. How do you think that the Linux challenge at LTT is going to play out? Let us know. Send us an email, show@offtopical.net. Cool, man. Well, I think that's the whole episode. What do you think?
I think so. It's weird. How do we end it now that we've just ranted for an hour? I guess we end it by telling them where we're at and telling them how they can talk to us during the week. Of course, you can email us at show@offtopical.net. Yeah. You can also get me at on the Fediverse, not the Metaverse, the Fediverse, at Ryan Lee Sipes at mastodon.social. And you can tweet at me. Maybe I'll see it. It's at Ryan Lee Sipes.
Yeah, and I am at Gardner Bryant on Twitter. Yeah, that's the word. And I'm also Gardner Bryant on YouTube.
Do you want to plug any of your YouTube videos? I feel like you should do this time. Like, just say like the most recent one you did, and tell people where they can check it out. I guess they know your channel. But.
Yeah. So I got a video coming out, and it's about the Steam Deck news that they just came out with about like how they're grading games on Steam to be compatible with the deck, and I think that that's very important. And that's something that I've been asking them to do for years, so they finally listened to me.
Well, we know you got their ear. You just called up Gabe and you were like, "Hey,
Gabe,
you got to listen this out."
But yeah, that's the next video coming out on my channel, so I'm pretty happy with that.
That's awesome.
But yeah, I think that's going to do it for this episode of the Off Topical podcast. Thanks everybody for listening. Send us an email because the email's working now, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Yep. See you next time.